Hi, Grandma here reading The Sign of the Beaver by Elizabeth George Speare. And I'm going to start with chapter 7 after a little bit of a review. In our previous chapters, Ben was injured trying to get honey out of a tree from the bees and from falling into a lake. He was rescued by an Indian, Saknus, and his son Attean. And they have nursed Ben back to health to some degree, bringing him food, getting him a crutch to walk on. And Matt wonders, not Ben, Matt. Matt wonders how it is that he can repay them. And they have stumbled upon the fact that Matt can read. And so Saknus would like for Attean to learn how to read so that he's not deceived by treaties that the white men create. All right, chapter 7. Before he had his eyes open next morning, Matt knew that something was wrong with the day. When it came back to him, he sat up with a groan. Attean! What had possessed him to give a book to an Indian? How could he possibly teach a savage to read? He tried to think back to the time his mother had taught him his ABCs. He could plainly see that brown-covered primer she held in her hands. He had detested it. He had had to learn the short verses printed beside each letter. A. In Adam's fall we sinned all. That would hardly do. To be honest, he wasn't sure to this day what it meant. He would feel mighty silly trying to explain it to a heathen. Then happily he recalled another book that he had been sent to his sister, Sarah, from England, with a small picture to illustrate each letter. No nonsense about Adam. A was for apple. Sarah had been luckier than he. But he had no way of making pictures, and there were no apples here in the forest. What could he find for an A that an Indian would understand? He looked about the cabin. T for table. That was unlikely they'd get as far as T. How about A for arm? That was simple enough. B. His eyes fell on the leg bone of the squirrel left from last night's meal. The stub of a candle would do for C. D. Door would be just the word for Attean. He certainly could walk out of one fast enough, and would again, no doubt, long before they got to D. The truth is, Attean doesn't want to. This is something his grandfather wanted. He doubted that Attean would come. Still, he had better be ready. He stirred the fire, ate a chunk of the cold Indian corn cake, and set about to prepare a classroom. He shoved the two stools together and laid Robinson Crusoe on the table. He did not have paper or ink. He found a ribbon of birch bark in a corner and tore off a strip, sharpened a stick to the point. Then he waited. Attean came, swinging a dead rabbit by the ears. He slung it disdainfully on the table. "Thank you," Matt said. "That's a big one. I won't need anything else for several days." His politeness brought no response. "Sit here," he ordered. He hesitated. "I never thought as how I'd have to teach anyone to read, but I have figured out a way to start." Silently, the boy sat down as straight and rigid as a cedar post. When Matt hunched himself onto the other stool, the boy's scowl deepened. Plainly, he did not like having the white boy so close to him. Attean had no need to be finicky, Matt thought. He smelled none too sweet himself. The grease smeared on his body, even on his hair, stunk up the whole cabin. It was supposed to keep off the mosquitoes, he'd heard, but he thought he'd rather have the pesky insects himself. He drew a letter on the birch bark. "This is the first letter," he explained. A. A is for arm. He repeated this several times, pointing to his own arm. Attean kept to a stubborn, scornful silence. Matt set his jaw. He could be stubborn too, he decided. He opened Robinson Crusoe. "We'll pick out the A's on the page," he said, trying to control his impatience. He pointed. "Now, you show me one." Attean stared straight ahead of him in silence. Then, to Matt's astonishment, he grudgingly laid a grubby finger on the letter A. Good, said Matt, copying the word sockness used so often. Find another. Suddenly, the boy broke his silence. White man's book foolish, he scoffed. Write arm, 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 all over paper. Puzzled at first, Matt saw his own mistake. Hundreds of other letters begin with A, he exclaimed, or have A in them, and there are 25 more letters. Attean scowled. How long? He demanded. What do you mean? How long Attean learns signs in book? Well, it will take some time, Matt said. There are a lot of long words in the book. 1 moon? 1 month? Of course not. It might take a year. With one swift jerk of the arm, Attean knocked the book from the table. Before Matt could speak, he was out the cabin and gone. Well, reckon that's the end of the lesson, Matt said to himself. Cheerfully, he began to skin the rabbit. I'm going to pause here for a second. I used to teach English as second language, and one of the most difficult things to do was to teach children English teach children how to read English who could not speak English. So what they are attempting to do is extremely difficult. Just thought I'd throw that out there. Chapter 8. By the next morning, he was half sorry the boy would not be coming again. He didn't know whether he was annoyed or relieved when Attean walked through the door without a sign or greeting and sat down at the table. Matt decided to skip B for bone. In the night, he'd thought of a better way. This book isn't a treaty, he began. It's a story. It's about a man who gets shipwrecked on a desert island. I'll read some of it out loud to show you. He opened Robinson Crusoe at the first page and began to read. I was born in the year 1632 in the city of York. He stopped. He remembered suddenly how the first time he'd tried to read this book, he'd found that first page so dull, he had come close to giving up right there. He'd better skip the beginning and get on with the story if he wanted to catch Attean's attention. I'll read the part about the storm at sea, he said. He'd read the book so many times that he knew exactly where to find the right page. Taking a deep breath as though he were struggling in the water himself, he chose the page where Robinson Crusoe was dashed from the lifeboat and swallowed up in the sea. Nothing can describe the confusion of thought which I felt when I sunk into the water, for though I swam very well, yet I could not deliver myself from the waves so as to draw breath, for I saw the sea come after me as high as a great hill and as furious as an enemy. Matt looked up from the page. There was not a flicker of interest in the boy's face. Had he understood a single word? Discouraged, he laid down the book. What did a storm at sea mean to a savage who had lived all his life in the forest? Well, he said lamely, it gets better as you go along. Once more, Attean took him by surprise. White man get out of water? He asked. Oh, yes, Matt said, delighted. Everyone else on the ship is drowned. He gets thrown up all alone on an island. The Indian nodded. He seemed satisfied. Shall I read more of it? Attean nodded again. Go now, he said. Come back, Seba. That means tomorrow. The next morning, there was no question of B for bone. Matt had the book open and waiting at the part he wanted to read. This is about the morning after the storm, he explained. Robinson Crusoe looks out and sees that part of the ship hasn't sunk yet. He swims out and manages to save some things and carry them to shore. He began to read. Once again, it was impossible to tell whether Attean understood. Presently, Matt slowed down. It was discouraging, reading to a wooden post. But Attean spoke at once. White man not smart like Indian, he said scornfully. Indian not need thing from ship. Indian make all thing he need. Disappointed and cross, Matt put the book down. They might as well get on with the alphabet. He drew a B on the birch bark. After Attean had gone, Matt kept thinking about Robinson Crusoe and all the useful things he'd managed to salvage from the ship. He'd found a carpenter's chest, for instance, with bags of nails, 2 barrels of bullets, and a dozen hatchets. A dozen! Why, Matt and his father had come up here to Maine with 1 axe and an adze. They had cut down trees and built this whole cabin and the table and the stools without a single nail. Crusoe had found a hammock to sleep in instead of a prickly hemlock boughs. He could see now how it must have sounded to Attean. Come to think of it, Robinson Crusoe had lived like a king on that desert island. Chapter 9. A few mornings later, at the end of the lesson, Matt delayed Attean. "How did you kill that rabbit?" he asked, pointing to the offering Attean had thrown on the table. "There's no bullet hole in it." "Indian not use bullet for rabbit," Attean answered scornfully. "Then how? There's no hole at all." For a moment it seemed that Attean would not bother to answer. Then the Indian shrugged. "Attean show," he said. "Come." Matt was dumbfounded. It was the first sign the Indian had given of, well, what exactly? He'd not sounded friendly, but there was not time to puzzle this out right now. Attean was walking across the clearing, and he apparently expected Matt to follow. Pleased and curious, Matt hobbled after him, grateful that he no longer needed the crutch. At the end of the clearing, the Indian stopped and searched the ground. Presently, he stooped down under a black spruce tree, picked into the dirt, and jerked up a long snake-like root. He drew from the leather pouch at his belt a curious sort of knife. The blade curved into a hook. With one sure stroke, he split one end of the root, then peeled off the bark by pulling at it with his teeth. He separated the whole length into 2 strands, which he spliced together by rolling them against his bare thigh. What do you think he's making? Well, we'll see. Next, he searched about in the bushes till he found 2 forked saplings about 3 feet apart. He trimmed the twigs from these, drawing his knife toward his chest as Matt had been taught not to do. Then he cut a stout branch and rested it lightly across the forks of these saplings. From the thread-like root, he made a noose and suspended it from the stick so that it hung just above the ground. He worked without speaking, and it seemed to Matt that all this took him no time at all. "Rabbit run into the trap," he said finally. "Pull stick into bush so white man can kill." "Golly," said Matt, filled with admiration. "I hadn't thought of making a snare. I didn't know you could make one without string or wire." "Make more," Attean ordered, pointing into the woods. "Not too close." After Attean had gone, Matt managed to make 2 more snares. They were clumsy things, and he was not too proud of them. Splitting a slippery root, he discovered, was not as easy as it looked. He spoiled a number of them before he mastered the trick of splicing them together. They did not slide as easily as the one Attean had made, but they seemed strong enough. Next morning, he showed his traps to Attean. He had hoped for some sign of approval, but all he got was a grunt and a shrug. He knew that to Attean his work must look childish. However, on the 3rd day, one of his own snares had been upset, though the animal had gotten away. The day after that, to his joy, there was actually a partridge struggling to free itself in the bushes where the stick had caught. This time, the grunt with which Attean rewarded him sounded very much like his grandfather's good. Silently, the Indian watched as Matt reset the snare. Then they walked back to the cabin, Matt swinging his catch as nonchalantly as he had seen Attean do. "You don't need to bring me any more food," he boasted. "I'll catch my own meat from now on." Nevertheless, Attean continued to bring him some offering every morning. Not always fresh meat. He seemed to know exactly when Matt had finished the last scrap of rabbit or duck. Sometimes he brought a slab of corn cake or a pouch full of nuts. Once a small cake of maple sugar. Plainly, he felt bound to keep the terms of his grandfather's treaty. Matt stuck to his part of the bargain as well, though the lessons were an ordeal for them both. Matt knew well enough what a poor teacher he was. Sometimes it seemed that Attean was learning in spite of him. Once the Indian had resigned himself to mastering 26 letters, he took them in a gulp, scorning the childish candle and door and table that Matt had devised. Soon he was spelling out simple words. The real trouble was that Attean was contemptuous, that the whole matter of white man's words seemed to him nonsense. Impatiently, they hurried through the lessons to get on with Robinson Crusoe. Matt suspected that the only reason Attean agreed to come back day after day was that he wanted to hear more of that story. Skipping over the pages that sounded like sermons, Matt chose the selections he liked best himself. Now he came to the rescue of the man Friday. Attean sat quietly, and Matt almost forgot him in his own enjoyment of his favorite scene. Now, Friday is a native. They are not Native Americans, but he was a native of wherever it was that Robinson Crusoe landed. So I think Attean is going to see some similarities to Friday with himself and Matt. Okay. There was the mysterious footprint on the sand, the canoes drawn up on the lonely beach, and the strange, wild-looking men with 2 captives. One of the captives they mercilessly slaughtered. The fire was set blazing for a cannibal feast. Then the second captive made a desperate escape, running straight to where Crusoe was standing. 2 savages pursued him with horrid yells. Matt glanced up from the book and saw that Attean's eyes were gleaming. He hurried on. No need to skip here. Crusoe struck a mighty blow at the first cannibal, knocking him senseless. Then, seeing that the other was fitting an arrow into his bow, he shot and killed him. Matt read on. The poor savage who fled but had stopped, though he saw both his enemies had fallen, yet was so frightened with the noise and fire of my piece that he stood stock still, and neither came forward nor went backward. I hallooed again to him and made signs to him to come forward, which he easily understood. And came a little way, they stopped again. He stood trembling as if he had been taken prisoner, and just been to be killed, as his 2 enemies were. I beckoned to him again to come to me, and gave him all signs of encouragement that I could think of. And he came nearer and nearer, kneeling down every 10 or 12 steps, in token of acknowledgement for saving his life. I smiled at him and looked pleasantly and beckoned him to come still nearer. At length he came close to me. Then he kneeled down again, kissed the ground, taking my foot, set it upon his head. This, it seemed, was a token of swearing to be my slave forever. Attean sprang to his feet, a thundercloud wiping out all pleasure from his face. Nada, he shouted, not so. Matt stopped bewildered. Him never do that. Never do what? Never kneel down to white man. But Crusoe had saved his life. Not kneel down, Attean repeated fiercely. Not be slave, better die. Matt opened his mouth to protest, but Attean gave him no chance. In 3 steps, he was out of the cabin. Now he'll never come back, Matt thought. He sat slowly turning over the pages. He had never questioned that story. Like Robinson Crusoe, he thought it natural and right that the wild man should be the white man's slave. Was there perhaps another possibility? The thought was new and troubling. Well, that was certainly interesting, and I do applaud Matt's efforts on teaching him to read. better to have a story that someone is interested in and can kind of pull pieces out of it and understand it. And then, as the teacher and me, what I would do is I would then go back and have them retell it to me, and I would write it down using the words that they had, that they could use in English. And then that's how I taught them to read. Okay, bye-bye.